Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning report for Wednesday, 11 June 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike. Let's get started with the domestic sit rep. So yesterday, a federal grand jury handed down an indictment for Representative LaMonica McIver, who is the New Jersey Democrat who was involved in that scuffle with ICE agents outside of the Delaney Hall detention facility in Newark, New Jersey in May. And according to the DOJ, this indictment is for forcibly impeding and interfering with law enforcement. And I have not seen yet a hearing scheduled for this indictment handed down by the grand jury. And yesterday, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem accused Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum of encouraging violent protests in Los Angeles, California. Sheinbaum denied the accusation and said that Mexico has activated consular services to protect any detained Mexican nationals. The EPA is planning to announce a repeal of the Biden administration's Clean Power Plan 2.0 rule. And as we've covered extensively, this rule imposed stricter emission standards on coal-fired power plants, and utilities across the country said that it was going to run coal power plants out of business and significantly increase the vulnerability of U.S. grids. And people familiar with these plans said that this announcement could come as soon as today. Minnesota is the latest state to roll back subsidies for illegal aliens, and they passed a budget bill yesterday that is going to repeal a 2023 state law that allowed illegal immigrants to access their state-level Medicare, Medicaid program, which is called Minnesota Care. And it's a state-funded healthcare system that uses taxes on hospitals and other healthcare facilities to fund this program. Governor Tim Walz said he is going to sign this bill. And then finally, Canada extradited a Pakistani man to the U.S. to face a trial for plotting to shoot a Jewish community center in New York last year. And the FBI and Canadian authorities arrested the man prior to his plane shooting on the 7th of October, 2024. And the FBI claims he had been in contact with the Islamic State. And Jared, if you could come on and take us through the global sit rep, please.
Absolutely. So a whole slew of American allies laid sanctions on Israeli officials yesterday. These were Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom. They placed variously between them. They placed sanctions or travel bans on Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. And the sanctions are for Israel's actions in Gaza and preventing a two-state solution. Over in Russia, the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said this morning that Russia is ready to offer practical and political assistance to both the U.S. and Iran in order to help them achieve a nuclear deal. And one of the practical examples he suggested was that Russia would take excess uranium away from Iran and then adapt it for reactor fuel purposes instead of much higher purity for weapons purposes. And the State Department also issued sanctions yesterday. They issued them on five different charities. They're calling them sham charities, and 5 individuals, each at the top of those charities, for financially supporting Hamas and one linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Now, none of the charities or individuals were actually listed in the announcement, but they did say that the charities are operating in Algeria, Italy, the Netherlands, Turkey, the West Bank, and Gaza. At Claudia Sheinbaum, the Mexican president's press conference yesterday, she said that 20,000 Mexicans have taken their right to return to Mexico, actually just saying, all right, cool, we will repatriate ourselves. And this is through an official Mexican repatriation program. She also added that Mexican consulates are working with anybody who would like to return. And then lastly, the European Central Bank announced this morning that gold surpassed the euro as the second largest reserve holding in the world last year.
All right, well, let's move on to our warning items for today. We have some upcoming protest events. 71 today, and I think we're tracking over 2,000 for the 14th of June, the No Kings protests. Then moving on to our first warning item. President Trump said yesterday that the administration is going to delay winding down FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, until after this year's hurricane season. And Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said that DHS is planning to create an advisory council in the coming months, and they're going to plan the future of FEMA, which she said is going to empower governors to respond to emergencies and ensure that federal money is being spent appropriately. So it looks like states are going to get a reprieve from taking on more responsibility for natural disaster funding for at least this year. However, the Trump administration does appear to be moving forward with plans to, one, significantly raise the per capita damage cost threshold. Basically, this is the calculation made where they divide the cost of a disaster by the population of a state or a county to determine when federal funds kick in. And right now, I think the statewide per capita indicator is $1.89 for this year. And the plan is to, I think, triple that. And this is likely going to disproportionately impact less densely populated rural states and local governments because they already have fewer disaster response resources. And if the overall dollar cost damage is not high enough, then they will also not receive FEMA funding. Moving on to our next warning item. The food distribution giant United Natural Foods, or UNFI, they filed a Securities and Exchange Commission filing on Monday saying that they became aware of a network intrusion last week on the 5th of June. And the UNFI said they're working to bring their networks and services back online because this intrusion is causing ongoing disruptions to its distribution operations. As we've reported on recently, state-backed and cyber criminal groups have increased cyber attacks on U.S. manufacturing in recent years, which has revealed some vulnerabilities in U.S. supply chains. And I think this latest cyber attack against UNFI reveals an additional vector for disruption of the U.S. food supply chain, which could be exploited by China in the event of a crisis or conflict. I think Mike covered this yesterday with the latest Chinese national scientists caught bringing biological material into the United States. The U.S. food supply chains are very vulnerable. One of those areas of vulnerability is actually, as we've talked about over probably the last 2 years, the USDA and the FDA have had pretty lax enforcement on food safety, in that we have seen cross-contamination of bacterial and infections, like with the baby formula issue during COVID, lead contamination in applesauce. I think we covered that a couple of years ago in a food processing facility in Ecuador that imports in the United States. So the U.S. food supply chain is pretty vulnerable. And now, I think with China likely targeting U.S. food supply chains with bacterial, with bioagents like the roundworm, which was the one yesterday, and previously a fungal infection that causes billions of dollars in damage to U.S. crops. Now we see a vulnerability, another vector that China could exploit by conducting cyber attacks or ransomware attacks against U.S. food distributors. Moving on, we have some updates on the LA riots. So the federal district court in San Francisco is scheduled to take up an emergency request from California Governor Gavin Newsom. And Newsom's trying to block National Guard and federal troops from supporting immigration enforcement operations, and this hearing is scheduled for tomorrow. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass also implemented a curfew yesterday over downtown LA, and this curfew is from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. local time. And in a podcast yesterday, Newsom warned that the Trump administration's deployment of the National Guard to LA is actually a test for California state and local government, and that Trump is going to try to replicate these types of deployments across the country. Jared, if you could come on and take us through your warning item for today, please.
Absolutely. So the Philippine Navy announced this morning that the American Nemesis system, which is the Navy Marine Corps Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, it's an anti-ship missile system from the coast, that is going to stay in the Philippines so that the Philippine Marines can train more efficiently with the United States Marine Corps. Now, the Nemesis is, like I said, an anti-ship missile system. It was last seen near Taiwan. We have it plotted here. It's the little red hashed circles right in the center. This is capable of remote launch and shutting down a key strait that would help facilitate a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. Now, this follows a much larger trend of the U.S. pre-positioning forces around Taiwan around Taiwan and the Western Pacific as China's 2027 military readiness deadline approaches. And when the Nemesis was initially deployed, this was something that I said I was almost certain was going to happen, was the U.S. Marine Corps is just going to leave it there as long as the host country allows it, because why wouldn't you pre-position this stuff? And there was a track record of it with the Army doing something similar with the Typhoon missile system. Now, the Philippines will not have firing authority over the system, but they do have control over the system for training purposes. So if China wants to achieve its military deadline, I think it's going to have to develop a counter for these now semi-permanent systems, or somehow prevent further deployment. Given what I've seen of their anti-ship missile defense capabilities, I think China will probably go toward preventing further deployment. I do have to figure out how that would actually look, though.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers for today. If you can start rounding up questions. I did see a comment from Frozen Nomad that, to be fair, my limited understanding is that Mexican nationals represent a pretty small percentage of recent Biden-era illegal crossings. So I think this was in response to the Mexican repatriation program. Well, yeah, that is a good point, that there were a significant proportion of who the Biden administration brought in were a lot of these flights that effectively jumped the border, that included a lot of foreign nationals from countries other than Mexico. But with the Mexican repatriation program, I think that's just part of a larger international political program the Mexican government has. So, like, an example of that is that there are effectively polling places in the United States where Mexican nationals that are here, that are still citizens of Mexico, whether they're here in the United States legally or illegally, can go vote in Mexican elections. Like, they have a pretty robust international political program and repatriation program. The people coming in through that are likely Mexican nationals, not people who are then further going on to other countries south of Mexico.
Yeah, this was actually a direct response to one of our subscribers saying, "Yeah, here we go," that 20,000 is basically just a drop in the bucket. And yes, it absolutely is. But one thing I think we really have to keep in mind: the size of the task at hand. You're talking, on the low end, people are still saying 11 million illegals. On the high end, I've seen estimates as high as 100 million. It really depends on who you ask. Regardless, it's a titanic undertaking. And yeah, 20,000 is not a lot, but it's 20,000 through one ongoing program. The United States Immigration Enforcement has pushed out plenty of thousands themselves. There are people, as is documented currently by the Mexican government, there are people repatriating themselves. Not all of them are going to go through official channels. We don't have those numbers. So yes, it's a drop in the bucket, but it's also essentially one small puzzle piece for a much larger picture. And I think we're going to see a lot. I think the official numbers are probably going to have a much more outsized effect on what the unofficial numbers actually are, and we won't really ever get those until we do a census later on.
All right, well, let's move on to the next question. If you can bring that up for me, Jared. This is from Ben T. It's being widely reported that LA riots are being funded and the Trump administration is jumping into action to combat it. Has this funding suddenly appeared, or has it been there all along and perhaps increased in this latest push for societal chaos? Taking a look, I think when we started covering the Stop Cop City stuff, looking at how that was funded, I don't think this has suddenly appeared. A lot this nonprofit system that's so opaque, even the IRS apparently doesn't understand how it actually works. A lot of this money that if there is funding, organized funding in the LA protests and riots, a lot of that money probably already existed and was being basically funneled through different nonprofits. The National Lawyers Guild was one of the big ones in the Stop Cop City protests. And they're probably also receiving a lot of individual donations, small dollar donations to like the bail funds, which was again in the Atlanta bail fund case, there were a lot of small dollar donations as well. So it's I'm sure there is likely a recent surge in those small dollar donations, but any large pools of money being moved through nonprofits probably already existed and are now being used. All right, well, let's move on. From Elwindor, what is the significance of gold overtaking the euro for reserves? Well, I'll let our resident gold bug answer this question.
As far as the actual significance of it, the fact that the European Bank is saying, "Hey, this is now outpacing us," I think it shows that this is not just a significant milestone for gold achieving things, but they are pointing out that yes, now gold is more trustworthy than us. What its wider effects are, I'll kick this question over to Mike once he's back. That way, he can actually, being our finance guy or our economy guy, he can actually really help with that. We did have one saved from yesterday. This was from Frozen Nomad. Regarding the recent executive orders regarding drones, does it significantly affect civilian drone hobbyists in either what drones they can use or further restrictions in how or where they can use them? And Robert,
I didn't see anything in these two executive. Well, there's really three executive orders, but the two big ones were one that's focusing on building up U.S. domestic drone manufacturing, and a lot of that has to do with requiring federal agencies to only purchase U.S.-made drones and drone components. And the other one's more focused on counter-drone authorities for security purposes. I don't think this will have a major effect on drone hobbyists beyond what's already happened during the Biden administration, like the requirement for FAA licensing for hobbyist drones over over a certain height, over a certain flight ceiling. I don't think this is going to, at least for now, I don't think it will have a major effect on how hobbyists can use drones. I do think it could have a larger market effect in the future on what is available. I think U.S. drones will become cheaper if this does actually spur the U.S. domestic drone industry.
Yeah, and I was reading a bit of those yesterday as well, and it seems like this is largely commerce focused. So, like you said, probably shouldn't touch hobbyists too much aside from creating no-fly zones, because those have to be flight lanes. That could get interesting inside of cities.
All right, and then from Ben T. Is political elite support of illegal immigration more about importing cheap labor or changing election outcomes? Something else? Well, I think it could be argued for both. Mike and I have talked about this idea that the Democratic Party has a political project to shift the basically the electoral battleground of certain states like Texas or Florida. But I do think there is an angle here for cheap labor. There is support for basically the idea is that gross domestic product is the one measuring stick for economic growth. And how do you make that go up? Well, you have more people consuming in services and goods, and importing a large population means more goods and more services are consumed necessarily. So that is one angle, one component of this, that there's a need to keep the GDP growth going by importing more consumers. As far as something else, I don't know. I think those are probably the two biggest ones, because Democrats have said for a long time, as long as I've been paying attention to politics for the last almost 20 years, one big slogan from the Democratic Party legislators and supporters and commentators has been that demographics is destiny. So I think they've been pretty open about the idea of changing the electoral landscape in the United States. I don't think that's really a secret, at least until recently. So those are I think the two both two major components to support for increasing mass immigration. And I think there's also I think there really is among the Democratic voter base, they do view this as effectively a compassionate move. Like I think there is also a component of this that are just true believers, and they think that this is good for the sake of it rather than some political or economic goal.
All right. Well, Do one last sweep, and
well, if
I
that's
don't see any more questions.
if that's it for questions today, we'll be back with you at 08 Central tomorrow. Be safe and stay out front.